everybody. Welcome again. Do we have any new people here since this morning? Raise hands. Excellent. I'll go through my little spiel again. Some of you may get to hear that multiple times today, so bear with me on that. My name is Erin Quinn Belcho. I am the Lacey Museum Curator, and we are so delighted that you decided to come to the exhibit opening of Sasquatch Revealed and to hear our terrific speakers today. If you get a chance, it'd be great to go by the museum. It'll be here all summer, the exhibit, both here at City Hall and at the museum. And if you love what we're doing here today, please feel free to make a donation so that we can continue to offer these terrific free programs. We really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker, Gene Baade. Gene is a Washington-based Sasquatch writer and researcher with over 40 years of interest in the subject. He has authored several articles on the subject, ranging from a study on a six-toed Sasquatch trackway in Wisconsin, all the way to examples of representations of the Windigo in material culture. Gene also has over 30 years' experience in the antiquarian book trade and runs Gene W. Baade Books on the West, which has issued catalogs of rare, used, and collectible books relating to Native American history, Western, Americana, and even Bigfoot. Baade also published a primer commenting on book collecting and the significance of Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist by Roger Patterson. Please join me in welcoming Gene up here to speak to you today.
Good afternoon. We're 5 minutes into it. Great to be here with you today. A couple of comments about my presentation. I'm going to be reading quite a bit of text. You don't have to do that. If you want to just look at the pictures, read the captions, I'm not going to be reading all of the captions. At some point, this presentation will be posted online. You'll be able to read some of the fine print. And I'm going to be a little bit pedantic here. I'm not going to be as interactive during the main presentation. Perhaps there'll be questions at the end. So please forgive that, and I hope you will enjoy the show. My presentation is titled, When Art Imitates Life, the Wild Man from Medieval Europe to Modern New York. And my opening panel shows a part of a very long tapestry that was displayed last year at the Morgan Library in New York City, which I happened to be there when the exhibit took place. We'll be talking about that. It shows wild men assailing a Moorish castle in northwestern Africa, dates from about 1440, and I'd simply like to point out a couple of things. First of all, there's a child, here is a woman, there are several wild men. This is a wild woman, a wild child. And throughout my presentation, the works of art will, for the most part, depict wild people with hair, and that hair is represented by these heavy curved lines. The art of antiquity in Europe is vast beyond belief. In it, a creature consistently referred to as the wild man is represented in every medium: panel paintings, manuscript illustrations, glass vessels, many, many others. This is a reference from the Met Museum of New York 1980 catalog, because in 1980, I learned a few years ago, had a major exhibit on the wild man. On the left is a wild couple supporting the arms of Grafschaft, which means County Kyburg. It's from 1500. You'll see a wild man and a wild woman holding the shield. On the right is a musician's badge, and at the bottom it is supported by the wild man. I will be making, obviously, many references to the North American Sasquatch. Summary. Oscar Wilde argued that life imitates art more than art imitates life. In the case of the wild man of medieval Europe, however, centuries of art depicting them may suggest that art does imitate life, that wild men and women and children really existed and were represented not because they were exotic imaginary fictions, but because they were real. More recently, ethnoanthropologists and others have, with regard to reports of similar hominoids by First Peoples, immigrants, that's us and descendants, us, in North America, opined that myths and psychologically embedded fears and customs are the reasons for these reports and thus do not represent anything real. Another explanation that actually I ran across in a new book that will be published next month or in July by Atlantic Monthly Press. The author suggests that archetypical templates or patterns of wild men images have been embedded in our brains from ancient memories and stories and are projected onto otherwise easily explainable shapes or animals that we see. So our brain might persuade us to believe that a vague outline along a forest line is a Bigfoot when it's merely a stump or a common animal or just a shadow. And of course, as Chris told us, a stump can be a Sasquatch. I will suggest that these medieval figures, depicted as type and certainly as not as individual portraits, represented real bipedal hominoids, but not Homo sapiens, who were usually hairy, not always, and usually large, even giant in size, but not always. As we know, evidence of human-like hairy giants is by no means only an old European or Asian phenomenon. Even without a type specimen, the evidence is abundant. Please note, I'm not asserting that the medieval European wild man is exactly the same as the Sasquatch. We are learning from modern discoveries that there were a variety of hominids in various parts of the world in prehistoric times, and it's reasonable today and in the last 2 or 3 millennia when these reports have been abundant that they're not all the same. On the right, of course, is one of the all-time classic photographs framed 352 from the Patterson-Gimlin film. Who I am, a student of Sasquatch Bigfoot phenomena for over 50 years. I'm dating back to when I probably read men's magazines in barbershops. But then there was the Patterson-Gimlin film. I'm a graduate of Oklahoma State University, Concordia Theological Seminary, and Valparaiso University. I've been a Lutheran pastor, now part-time, for 48 years, as noted antiquarian bookseller specializing in the Old West. Oh, I need to show you that track. From my northern Wisconsin years, 15 years in northern Wisconsin as a pastor, I was interested, along with a close friend. We collected lots of stories. This is one track of 28 in a single trackway that I photographed in 1980. It's 19 inches long, about 6 inches wide at the ball. It has 6 toes. Each track was an individual placement of the foot with toes, extension, contraction, etc., different. It was not a planted fake foot. I'm also, as was noted, the author of Roger Patterson's Snowman book, a bibliography with accompanying essays about Sasquatch and book collecting. And Patterson's book was the first book printed entirely on the subject in 1966, although Ivan Sanderson published one a few years earlier that took in the Asian phenomena. One view, medieval literature is shot through with the mythology of the wild man, a quote from Richard Bernheimer in Wild Men of the Middle Ages, published in 1952. The front dust jacket shows coat of arms with skull, woman, and wild man by the famous engraver and artist Albrecht Dürer. From the Met catalog, it says, the wild man, which also had the same image in its catalog, the wild man guarded and upheld family dynasties as symbolized by their coat of arms. When animated, the wild men dramatized physical protection or procreation. And I'm just asking here, maybe both, by the approach of the wild man to the woman. Another view by Émile Malle from his book, Religious Art in France. Medieval sculptors did not invent the figures they created, but rather copied what they saw. So this is largely, this presentation is a tale of 2 exhibits. One from 1980, The Wild Man, Medieval Myth and Symbolism at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And the other one last year, which I was able to attend with my wife, Medieval Monsters, Terrors, Aliens, and Wonders at the Morgan Library. in the Big Apple, New York. Just photographs of the museums. By the way, all of the photographs here are mine except where so designated. A sampling of interior spaces. This is the cloisters, which is a part of the, most people think of the huge museum in Midtown Manhattan. The Met also owns the cloisters up at the upper end of Manhattan, near where my daughter used to live. And interiors, examples from the Morgan Library, which is phenomenal. I don't know who that person is in the picture, but I just kind of like the aspect that she's looking up this vast collection. Just note that the Morgan has not one, but 3 Gutenberg Bibles. So the Morgan divided up monsters into 3 categories: terrors, aliens, and wonders. And we have an example of each. St. Martha taming the Tarasque, which was a fearsome legendary dragon-like hybrid from Provence. In the middle is a siren, kind of a mermaid type with wings, from a book called Abuses of the World, 1510. And on the right, we see a unicorn, which they identify as a wonder. Just outside and separate from the main exhibit was a manuscript case designated in a furry mirror. By the way, when my wife and I went to this exhibit, I said, there's got to be wild men here. Well, they weren't in the main exhibit, but on the outside in a case were a few examples of wild men. The case was designated in a furry mirror. It appeared that the curators were unsure as to how to locate wild people in the exhibit. They did not seem to fit into the other categories. The case stated, lacking civilization and Christianity, wild people were thought to be free of the decadence and sin of modern life. In today's world, hairy, humanoid, cryptozoological figures such as Bigfoot, aka Sasquatch, occupy a similar conceptual space. I used these images in a program or in a presentation that was put on Chris's website. And I also sent a link to it to a client of mine in New York City who has a vast book collection. She happens to be on the board or is a very important person at the Morgan Museum. When I sent her this, she sent it to the curator of this exhibit, and they had a big laugh. Another example from that furry exhibit, presentation of the Virgin Mary at the temple by her parents. Note that the image, the illuminated manuscript image, is bounded on either side by a wild man. Alexander the Great, Wild Men and Women, from a German textual miscellany, mid-15th century, Augsburg. The scene derives from a popular story recounting the travels of Alexander the Great. Naked, shy, and apparently hairless. Although I think that that's a misinterpretation. They look hairy to me. These wild folk represent an idealized pre-lapsarian, which means time before the fall of man, way of life. Their rejection of civilization, indicated by their lack of clothing, was understood as a retreat from the dangers and temptations of society. Just how the wild man was viewed, regardless of whether he was a myth or a reality, was complex and changed over time. Early on, he was regarded as the embodiment of evil and paganism, or maybe just not a very desirable role model. In 2015, a BBC press release about a rare discovery in Suffolk, England, of a 14th century spoon handle contained a quote by Professor Ron Hutton of the University of Bristol, who himself quoted from a 19th century Spanish document describing the wild man as, quote, barbaric, chaotic, and unrestrained. He further said of the handle, this might have been given to someone as a present to remind them of how not to behave. He, the wild man, was a bogeyman in a world obsessed with religious and social order, an awful warning of the consequences of a lack of either. Well, actually, again, my interpretation of this handle would be different from that of the professor, because it doesn't seem to me that you're learning much in terms of how not to behave from that particular handle. That's just my view. If some depictions of the wild man were intended to serve as a warning to keep people who were tempted by or attracted to the wild man from going wild, socially or psychologically, or becoming apostate religiously, what about views of today's Sasquatch? Reversing the believed behavior-altering effect of the wild man in the professor's interpretation, we might ask, does fascination with Bigfoot today serve for some not as a negative, but a positive presence, a warning or correction against a world gone awry, socially, politically, economically, environmentally, and perhaps even scientifically? After all, Sasquatch is keeper of the earth, an agent of warning against environmental irresponsibility, is a popular view among some. So, does the Sasquatch, or the idea of Sasquatch, draw us to these things even if the chaotic wild man didn't? Early on, the wild man was depicted as cannibalistic, and that didn't disappear entirely over time. On the left is an 11th century image, and on the right, an early 16th century image. While the one on the right is not described as a wild man, but as a cannibal or werewolf, the Met catalog says, quote, several features link the werewolf and the wild man. The wild man was thought by many to abduct children, sometimes to adopt or exchange his own child for a human one, at other times for the purpose of cannibalism. And it's no secret that many North American tribal names for the Sasquatch are translated as cannibal. It's also true that dozens of indigenous cultures in North America have stories of the abduction of their women and children by the hairy giants, and in some cases, that fear is still alive. A number of tribal names for the creature. I'm going to use the word creature. I don't necessarily like to use that, but I'm going to use that as an alternative reference. Also translate to devil. I don't really care to meet the werewolf on the right. He's really torn up the place. A major theme represented in the art of the medieval wild man was the competition between pure and audible knights, representing church, virginity, marriage, and civilization on the one hand, and impure, lustful, lecherous wild men on the other. Complicating this appears to be a change in the opinion of the wild man as being a condemned creature to one which was innocent of sin. Serious, if not widespread, debate over both of these interpretations suggests that the wild man was not viewed as a myth, although stories had certainly mythological elements. I don't know that wild men actually stormed that castle in Spain, right? But as a real competitor and creature of interest in the flesh. Wild man, or desire with image of Venus, in this one leading Liriano, a woodcut. Quote, a large, hairy wild man with vines entwined around his waist holds a shield in one hand and cradles a statuette of a naked woman encircled by a flaming mandrola in his other arm. He leads a forlorn-looking youth whose hands are bound behind his back from a dense woods. In this image, the wild man is elevated from a symbol of mere sexuality into a rare allegorical one of unfulfilled sensual desire. In his usual context, the wild man is capable of almost all principal medieval attitudes toward women, except the courtly one of restrained adulation and respect. He is thus a natural opponent of the knight, who represents the discipline and civility the wild man lacks. Late in the period, wild people became symbolic of primal innocence, unstained by the fall described in Genesis. The wild man in his more benign aspect was variously described in art as a gatherer, a hunter, a keeper of the forest, even a farmer and family man. Many people today like to refer to the Sasquatch as the forest giants or forest people. First people's names for the Sasquatch commonly mean wild man of the woods or wild woman of the woods. Regarding gathering and hunting, Sasquatch are frequently described as opportunists and reported to raid orchards, gardens, granaries, and even garbage bins. Hunters and fishermen have sometimes had their kills and catches taken by them. Both researchers and First Peoples have sometimes made it a practice to leave gifts of food for them, whether wild-caught or store-bought. Reports of Sasquatch hunting and fishing prowess and capabilities are not uncommon. Information gathered from some remote villages in the Caucasus and published by Marie Jean Kaufman and others, Igor Burtsev, Dmitry Bayanov, report the rare presence, at least in decades past, of the occasional almasty or leshy, and hominoids with different names having been very slightly domesticated on small farms and in rural homes and perhaps placed into some forms of servitude. While women were pictured as good mothers of their children and also able riders of horses or stags. Frequently, the wild man was a combatant, whether against human military opponents or his own giant rivals. And we will be exploring some of these themes in the next few frames. The wild man in combat with night, 15:3, black ink drawing. Regarding warlike activity, some First Nations and American Indian accounts and stories recount combat against hairy giants in former times. But occasionally, they may have been allies against common enemies. By the way, this is probably one of the most frequently seen images from the medieval period that's reproduced in books. On that theme, a Cheyenne peace chief once shared with me that the Kiowa Sasquatch type beings a long time ago followed them out of the mountains and onto the plains and sometimes fought at their sides. Afterwards, in 2015, I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art's exhibition, The Plains Indians, Artists of Earth and Sky. In that exhibit, a 1904 buffalo robe designed by Silverhorn, an Oklahoma Kiowa that was commissioned for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, depicts several Kiowa mythic beings, and these are only a couple, there are three. The large figure is Sende, a trickster who won't follow any rules and is always causing trouble. But what caught my eye was on the right side of the robe, Sapul, a cannibal ogre. Ogre is another word that's used in old literature for large hairy giants, who lives in the mountains and has a cedar tree growing on his head. Actually, this robe shows two figures, one with just the head showing and then the other one. I dug deeper into the presence of Sapul in Kiowa stories and found these two intriguing ritual figures. They were also done by Silverhorn, associated with the Sundance ceremony. They're drawings on paper. The information on them describes what they depict. On the left, Sende getting captured by Sapul. But on the right, lower right, the trickster finds a way to escape by grabbing onto a tree. Multiple themes and descriptions are suggested, such as abundant hairiness, with the exception of the face, with, different, as Chris pointed out, different presentations of that. The principal themes are abduction and cannibalism. Will Sende be a piquant dinner for Sapul? With these themes, a bridge is built between medieval thought and artistic expression and North American First Peoples thought and artistic expression, in my opinion. And while we have found no artistic rendering of baskets used for abduction and medieval art, in Pacific Northwest indigenous stories, the presence of a basket on the back of the wild woman in which to place kidnapped children is common. Returning to the combat theme, Alexander in combat with wild men and beasts. From the catalog, Alexander legends relate the history of the conqueror's military achievements with liberal additions of related adventures. Here, he and his men encounter a group of wild boars accompanied by both wild men and women who had 6 hands each. Just keep in mind that when you see a medieval image, it's not intended to be a photograph. There will be elements in it that certainly can't be true. That's just a part of storytelling. So I don't think it would be true that there would be 6 hands. Here's a rather grotesque scene. Alexander ordering, this is from the same manuscript, wild men thrown into fire. Just look at that, and that's just really a violent scene, and to me is just an amazing thing. You can't see this well because it's just the pages of a book, but I think you could find it online. The irony here is facing pages. The left page, victory of a knight over a wild man, 4 sides of a wooden casket. But on the right hand, Victory of a wild man over a knight on another casket. Here we have the combat of two wild men, an engraving. There is a body of evidence that suggests an affinity of modern giant hairy hominoids for the company of horses. Bayanov writes, wild men are fascinated by horses and other hoofed animals. A few years ago, a woman in British Columbia, I've talked with Thomas Steenberg about this, within an area John Green called in the land of the Sasquatch, in which Chris Murphy is identified as the Sasquatch Triangle, related to me, and this is only about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, that she and a fellow employee or two who worked in a rural stables had seen a Sasquatch on the property walking along a mountainside. When I later mentioned possible Sasquatch affinity for horses, she said, "That freaks me out." On various nights, she reported that the horse barn had been entered, stall gates had been opened, and weighty barrels of feed had been moved around. Turning to more specific scenes, the wild condition from the four conditions of society, from a work in 1500, France, where four miniatures, not all depicted here, only one of them, depicted society divided into four ways: the wild condition, the poor, the working, and the noble. From the catalog, the wild man dismisses the grand castles. Which you will see in the background here. Dismisses the grand castles which loom behind him as contrary to natural law and rejects excesses of any sort. In a lush natural setting with a fresh spring before his cave, the wild man enjoys health and satisfaction of his needs. And then there's a similar image from a different work on the right. By the way, I might say, I don't put it in print here, that some depictions of the wild man seem to be anatomically correct. I found the one on the left fascinating. It's a wood carving, maybe a choir stall, just titled Wild Man, but he reminded me of Rodin's The Thinker. And on the right, an illustration of a wild woman with her two children riding a stag. Wild folk family, woodcut. Quote, "The wild man's emerging position as an articulate critic of man's corrupt and degenerated social order could not be more pointedly expressed." From Germany. In the entertainment field, we mentioned the wild man as an object used for entertainment, maybe extremely rarely. Nevertheless, a depiction in an illuminated manuscript, the wild man dance of Charles VI. And on the right, a carnival figure from a book called a Schembart, or bearded mask book, that's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And he's carrying, of course, a branch or part of a tree, maybe an uprooted tree. We have here a wild couple jousting. Note, one of them is riding a unicorn. Two wild men and two pairs of lovers, a roundel with stained glass from Frankfurt. Wild people could be viewed almost Cupid-like as enablers of human love. From the catalog, in the four scenes of this roundel, young lovers and wild men are drawn together in a relationship of friendly camaraderie. The standing wild man at the left returns the wave of the reclining youth at the top. The erotic disports of the youthful couple seem to engage the moral support of the wild folk. End quote. This would be another reason for the church to disapprove of the wild man, even if it had moved away from its earlier position of the wild man as a depraved and condemned creature in the sight of God. Both the wild man and the wild woman hold clubs or cudgels, objects of frequent presence in medieval wild man images. Here we have wild woman with a unicorn, a fragment of a tapestry from Germany. And on the right, this is actually a playing card. And this one is Queen of Animals, and it's engraving on a small playing card. For some observers, there is an elephant in the room. It is the appearance of unicorns with wild people and unicorns in other settings in medieval art. If luminous white unicorns frequently appear in medieval art, why don't we suggest that they were real, if we were going to suggest that wild people who occupied similar spaces were real? How can we reasonably contend that medieval wild men and their mates and families were real if we deny the same to unicorns? After all, our thesis is that art imitates life. It is not only the hairy or not so hairy giants or wild people of lesser stature who capture our imaginations and stories, but unicorns and dragons. In fact, the latter have had quite a nice cinematic run in recent decades. You've probably seen a few movies with dragons in them in the last few years, right? But of course, unicorns did live. They did walk the earth, but that was 29,000 years ago in Siberia. And they were apparently more suited to heavy hauling, maybe mammoth carcasses, across the steppes than carrying princesses on their backs. Professor David Floyd of Charleston Southern University, who is also fascinated by the medieval wild man, suggested to me that, quote, art can be a composite of real and imagined beings, much like Egyptian art, which offers all kinds of strange hybrids and creatures next to their everyday cultural objects like boats or the sun. He continues, what we find is a mishmash of creatures, some real, some not, but all of whom serve symbolic functions in artistic mediums. We may consider wild people in medieval times as real, but not unicorns or dragons, in part because only the hairy giants have been reported in recent times and still are. Unicorns haven't and aren't. Only the hairy giants have in modern times been studied critically, even scientifically. Unicorns haven't. The presence of unicorns in art had profound meaning in medieval times, such as representing feminine virginity and the innocence of Christ. And you can still purchase unicorn art today, but their presence in art did not stem from physical reality. At least that's my contention. I'm waiting to be proved wrong. One can only study evidence if evidence is present, and there is plenty of it for hairy bipedal giants. There is none of which I'm aware for unicorns and dragons. Art imitated life when it came to the wild man, but not when it came to the unicorn. I don't have anything against them, but maybe I really don't want to meet a dragon. The tapestry on the right, excuse me, go back to that. That's at the cloisters, and it's one of 7 large tapestries depicting the hunting and capture and finally the killing of a unicorn. The Met Museum says this in the foreword. The exhibition, this is from 1980, exhibit, offers one of the most delightful and fascinating inventions of the medieval imagination. The hairy, primitive woodland creature who had first embodied all that medieval man hoped he was not. Then, as the old order declined, became the object of his envy. This quote summarizes the evolution of thinking about the wild man. And although references to wild men date back to BCE dates, initial medieval age presentation of the wild man about the 12th century was revolting, debased, and even evil. By the 15th century, however, the wild man might qualify as a good next-door neighbor, preferable to the same next-door neighbors we have in the 21st century. I've had really, really bad neighbors in my life. I would have preferred somebody, a family on the right that's depicted. The church likely kept a careful eye on the wild man. His personification of both evil and good, demonic and innocent, was likely in the background of awareness. The first major Christian writer to discuss the monstrous races, there were other figures larger than life that were called monsters, was St. Augustine, whose views were adopted by most later authors, such as Isidore of Seville in his Etymology. Traced the hierarchy of the divine order from the Holy Trinity down to the lowest creatures, with the monstrous races between man and the animal kingdom. So on the right, this roundel, stained glass, the divine order from wild men at the bottom to knights to angels. Augustine's claim that the wild men were created within the divine order was generally accepted throughout the medieval period. 15th century Strasbourg theologian Geiler von Kaiserberg, in one of a collection of sermons published under the title Die Mice, the ant, categorized 5 types of wild men. I'll just drop down to the 5th type, the Diaboli, satyr-like creatures identified with the mythic wild men called devils. Quote, von Kaiserberg dispels the superstitious and fearful notions associated with them. On the other hand, he notes that some wild men are consummately evil and must be construed as the work, if not the incarnation of the devil. He thus underscores the fundamental dualism of the wild man. End quote. Some illustrators of the Reformation shortly after von Kaiserberg found the imagery of the wild man useful. A wild man embellishes this engraving, which depicts the Pope as Satan in the guise of a wild man with devil's tail and ears, no less. It is no secret that serious researchers of the Sasquatch discuss and debate various reports of harmless, even benevolent Sasquatch on the one hand, and dangerous Sasquatch on the other. How interesting is it, therefore, that medieval reports of wild men described a similar dualism. But the reformers did not have a monopoly on inflammatory cartoon descriptions of their opponents. When Martin Luther was excommunicated, he was described in the papal bull, that's the document that excommunicated him, as a, quote, wild boar in the Pope's vineyard, end quote. And you can bet Roman artists salivated over that. However, in 1529, a cover or title page was designed for a pamphlet portraying Luther with 7 heads, all no doubt intended to be interpreted satirically. I won't go through all of them, but on the right, excuse me again, on the right, we have Luther the wild man, even holding a club. We have argued that with the wild man art imitated life, that various artists and craftsmen were not portraying a purely mythological figure, but a real one that lived in Europe, Western Asia, all the way to the Orient. Even though artists certainly embellished and perhaps invented certain ideas and activities, they were describing real hominoids who are usually of large size, almost always quite hairy. They obviously didn't need to have seen one to portray him any more than artists today would. The attitude of the church, not only toward the lifestyle and behavior of the wild man, but toward his redeemability. In other words, the possibility that he or she could be saved, seems to me to be evidence of the wild man's reality. I'm suggesting that the church would not have debated whether or not wild people could be redeemed if they did not think they existed, or if they existed only in imagination and art. To my knowledge, the church did not debate whether unicorns, dragons, or other monsters could be redeemed, only the wild folks. This would not have needed to be a constant debate because the church had a lot of other things, many other doctrines on its hands to argue and debate about. From the Met Catalog, while Augustine's claim that the wild men were created within the divine order was generally accepted throughout the medieval period, questions concerning the wild man's redeemability persisted. Heinrich von Hessler, who asserts the existence of wild men in his day, confesses, quote, whether they shall be saved or whether they shall be lost and fare with the devil, that will have to be left to God's mercy. It's from a commentary on the Apocalypse of St. John that we commonly know as the Book of Revelation. Quote, despite the arguments of St. Augustine and many of his followers to the contrary, popular belief held that the wild man was hopelessly damned. Except for particular classes of wildness, such as that of the Eremitic saints, referring to monks who lived in the desert as hermits, this conviction often or even received dogmatic reinforcement from theologians such as von Kaiserberg. Bernheimer, his book, Wild Men in the Middle Ages, argues that the wild man was purely mythological and was an invention that served to display the worst and best qualities of humans. He argued the wild man's mode of existence had to be construed as that of a creature not unlike man himself. What then was his status? Was he a human being, as his anatomy suggested? Or was he to be classified as an animal as seemed befitting when one considered his coat of hair and his bestial behavior pattern? Bernheimer continues, we find therefore that medieval authors and artists contradicted each other freely in defining him. Hence we see the various portrayals of the wild man, from lustful and undisciplined to normalized and almost civilized. But wait, is this not also a good description of Homo sapiens throughout the ages? Many a regular human being like you and me would like to live in the woods. Some do. Many spend their times in the wilderness and forest. We come home from the woods with leaves and botanical debris on our bodies and clothing, sometimes looking like wild people. Bernheimer again, quote, "The wild man holds thus a curiously ambiguous and ill-defined position in God's creation, being neither quite man enough to command universal agreement as to his human identity, nor animal enough to be unanimously classified as such." Today, the debate is joined. Is the Sasquatch human or animal, homo or ape? Many wild man depictions have him wielding a club, and a couple of references from recent books. Note that the wild man in this image is also holding a mace. In testimony by Major General Mikhail Topilsky, reprinted in Bayanov's book In the Footsteps of the Russian Snowman, the general reports that on a 1925 military operation in the western Pamirs, when his unit was pursuing a gang of anti-Soviet guerrillas, I'm not talking about the animal, I'm talking about guerrillas as out of the ordinary and dangerous paramilitary types that we all have seen in our history, from the Civil War and before and after. During negotiations of surrender, the guerrillas had sought refuge in a cave under a glacier when, quote, "some hairy man-like creatures howling inarticulately appeared. There were several of them, and they had staves or clubs. One of the guerrillas was clubbed to death by the creatures." End quote. The creature and some of the guerrillas were then killed in an avalanche. After removal of ice and snow, the former was examined by the general and the medical doctor on the mission. The latter said, quote, "At first glance, I thought the body was that of an ape. It was covered all over with hair. It was clear that it was not a human being." The occasional report of a Sasquatch carrying, but not as a weapon, the limb of a tree is recorded, and many reports of trees and bushes being uprooted and broken are found in the research literature. A close friend of mine who's a colleague in Michigan reported 2 or 3 years ago that one of his parishioners related to him that when this parishioner began using a chainsaw on his farm at the edge of a wood, something he couldn't see that was deeper in the woods became very upset. When the farmer turned off his chainsaw and eventually went into the woods to investigate, there was a fresh trail of uprooted small trees, shrubs, and broken branches. You just never know where you're going to get a story. Whether or not it's a Sasquatch or not, of course, I don't know. But when you talk to people, if you talk to them often enough, you will get interesting stories. In many depictions, wild people have specific parts of their bodies devoid of hair. Chris referred to some of that earlier. Elbows, knees, feet, palms of hands, and breasts. The Met Catalog in page 1 says, in physical appearance, the wild man differed from man mainly in his thick coat of hair, which left only his face, hands, feet, and with wild women, breasts bare. Sometimes wild men too. Elbows and knees were often exposed as though hair could not grow in these areas. Leafy foliage also present. On the previous page, we mentioned General Topilsky's report on the use of a stave during a deadly encounter in 1925. In this report, he also says this, quote, "In general, the hair was very thick. There was most hair on the hips. The knees were completely devoid of hair and has callous growths on them. The whole foot, including the sole, was quite hairless." And he had much more detail on the hair in his report. As to the Sasquatch, aside from its size, perhaps the most abundant information we have in now countless reports describes its hair, including where it appears on the body and where it does not, and its length and color. Whoa! Where did you come from, Mr. Green Giant? No discussion of the wild man would be complete without mentioning the ubiquitous green man. And we're going to do very little of that, but we could do loads. Superficially, the green man would appear to be pagan, perhaps a fertility figure or a nature spirit similar to the woodwoes, wild men of the woods, and yet he frequently appears carved in wood or stone in churches, chapels, abbeys, and cathedrals. many, many examples. About 5 years ago, my wife and I went to Yorkshire. We went into some of the little local churches, 800 or 900 years old, as well as to a couple of cathedrals. I always looked for the wild man figures inside. A study of the green man in art and architecture would be easily as extensive as his cousin or twin, the wild man. Both are in the woods, but the green man is always adorned with foliage. In contrast to the wild man, the green man is more narrowly defined with rebirth in nature, such as the spring equinox and the verdancy of the wild and man's symbiotic relationship with the natural world. And here we have an example of all places from Iraq. And this is the last slide. The following will be my credits. But the last slide, about 8 years ago when visiting the American Museum of Natural History in New York, reason why we go there, I have a daughter who lives there, so we go every year, go to different museums. I read the orientation statement that you see on this page, which was posted in the Hall of Human Origins. It seems to me that there are at least two premises that prevent science, quotes, from taking very seriously the study of purported living relic hominoids, homins, hairy, and often huge bipedal primates, particularly Bigfoot, Sasquatch, et al. One is the scientific position expressed in this posting. Quote, there is only one species of hominid on the planet today, modern humans. The other premise is not a scientific opinion, but it is one just as strong, if not stronger, in its persuasive simplicity. It can't exist, therefore it doesn't. The latter opinion is the fixed and closed viewpoint that living bipedal primates or hominoids other than Homo sapiens cannot possibly exist today, and therefore they don't. Any and all evidence that suggests that we ought to take a closer look is met at the outset with a preformed, dismissive, even derogatory conclusion. The case is closed. Or is it? Today, there is not only great interest among many in the general population about this field of study, granted much of it fueled by TV dramatizations, but especially in the last 60 years, a significant number of researchers internationally have pursued and are pursuing the truth of the claim that these creatures indeed exist. Also today, as in the past, indigenous peoples on several continents around the globe quietly assert that they have lived near these wild giants for a very long time. I presented one more angle of evidence to the proposition that there is more than, quote, only one species of hominid, end quote, alive today, and that the logic that it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, is not only scientifically and philosophically questionable, even untenable, but historically, artistically, and theologically questionable as well. I'm grateful to a number of people, to my friend Chris Murphy, who invited me to present today. Chris's books are amazing, and he also has an amazing website, Sasquatch Canada. To Dmitry Bayanov, one of the important hominologists in Moscow, beginning with his teacher, Dr. Boris Porshnev. And you can see Dmitry's books on the right, and of course his new one is just out. It's not pictured here. To Dr. David Floyd of Charleston Southern University, who I met a couple of years ago, who piqued my interest further in the wild man. And he shared his opinions with me, particularly on the unicorn. To my fellow presenters that I have heard, Chris, and look forward to this afternoon. To this museum, Marissa worked with me several times to clarify things, and I thank you for your kind attention and interest, the audience. Thank you.